we invite you for the plenary session. Is a new world war approaching? The new US security strategy towards Russia and China. What is the central vision of a renewed US engagement in the world? What role does Russia and China play in the US security strategy? Does the future hold a return of geopolitics and a grand bargain?
Thank you very much, Kasia. Welcome, everyone, and please, our panelists, please join us on the stage. My name is Michał Baranowski. I'm a director of the Warsaw office of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. It's a great pleasure to be back at WSF. We've been here from the very beginning, and the conference is just getting better and better. Pavel, right here, and we decided to start with a little question for the beginning of the second day. Are we approaching a third world war? And for Polish speakers in the audience, it could be said, kto wywołał trzecią wojnę światową? We have a fantastic panel who I'm going to introduce in 1 second. But just as a setup, I mean, it's increasingly clear that we live in a world where great power competition is back. It's a fact that has been recognized in the most recent U.S. national security strategy. It's been over almost a year now that the strategy has been published, and it's a strategy that emphasizes great power competition, in particular between U.S. and China and U.S. and Russia. Even though it was written by very much mainstream Republicans in the administration, it seems to be something that President Trump is following as well. And that's something that came out from the discussions yesterday. We are clearly also live in a world that the rules that have been governing our international liberal world order, including the rules governing our security relations, is dissolving. And most recent this week's example is U.S. withdrawal from the INF treaty following multiple violations of the Russian side of the treaty. So the questions we want to ask in this panel is: are we heading into world's disorder? Is conflict unavoidable? You might remember that yesterday General Hodges said that in his view, it's very likely that U.S. will be in war with China in 15 years. Is this unavoidable? But this is one of the questions we want to ask. Can we preserve the rule-based international system? Or can we build a new one? Finally, what does it mean for transatlantic community? What does it mean for Europe? And maybe for Central and Eastern Europe in particular? After all, we live here on the edge of the alliance, or what Norman Davis described as God's playground. So we have an excellent panel to answer these questions. To my left, please welcome Pavel Felgenhauer, the defense analyst from Novaya Gazeta from Russia. Please join me in welcoming Pavel. Dan Fried, who really needs no introduction in this room, but it's, of course, our dear colleague from the Atlantic Council, distinguished fellow, former ambassador, former Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. It's fantastic. Please join me. It's great to have you, Dan, with us. General Richard Sharif, former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe. It's great to have you back with us, General. Julie Smith, an old friend as well. Julie is now with us on this side of the Atlantic in Berlin. She's also a senior fellow with CNES. She's former advisor to national security advisor to Senator Biden, and who knows what happens in the next presidential election. Julie, it's great to have you with us. And Mr. Steve Tsang, associate fellow at the Chatham House. He's a very prolific writer, and what we would like to ask you is, what does China think about all this? Please join me in welcoming Mr. Tsang. So let me first go to Dan and then Julie too. If I can ask you, well, first to you, Dan. I mean, you both are coming from Washington, and if you could give us your understanding of the prism through which the Trump administration is looking at the world. I mentioned that this is it seems like a competitive prism, but if you could bring it a little bit closer to us, and if we could extrapolate a little bit going forward, what do you expect in the coming years, given the focus on the geopolitical competition? Dan, over to you.
That is not an easy question, Michał, because I can't describe the Trump administration as a singular actor, because it isn't. The Trump administration is basically right that we've entered an era of great power competition, a revisionist and aggressive Russia and a partly revisionist China. But there are also parts of the Trump administration that reject in principle the rules-based international order that has done so much good since 1945 and since 1989. Now, that's not the whole of the administration by any means. The administration, if you take it as the people who sort of run things day to day, Assistant Secretary Wes Mitchell, or Fiona Hill of the National Security Council, or Kurt Volker, the Special Envoy on Ukraine, they are within the Republican mainstream as we've known it since, say, Ronald Reagan. But there is the nationalist wing of the administration, which seems to believe that the values and system of pre-1914 Europe is somehow to be emulated or at least used for inspiration. That is, nationalism as a good thing, sovereignty as an absolute, and a principled mistrust of multilateralism. That, to me, is a problem, because I don't see how the democratic world, the free world as we used to call it, deals with the challenges of Russia and China without a sense of international solidarity. And I'd like to make one point inspired by what Norman Davies was saying. He said that Poland has not had it so good in the past generation at any time in its history, or at least since the 16th century. And I'd like to generalize that, because being in Warsaw, I'm inspired by the fact that really things since 1989 have been pretty good for Poland and very good for the United States. And good times, dobre czasy, to jak zdrowie, ile cię trzeba cenić, ten się dowie, kto ci stracił. Good times are like good health. You miss them only when they're gone.
Thank you very much. Then, so not a singular actor, nationalist voices, and if I remember correctly, President Trump recently said, "I'm a nationalist."
Boże, yes. And I wouldn't brag about it. And the trouble is that we can sleepwalk our way or talk ourselves in to war, and it bothered me that General Hodges, who knows what he's talking about, he's a wise person, dropped the line about war between the US and China so casually. I can see no circumstances whatsoever in which the United States or China end up better off having fought a war. Like, are you kidding me? This has been the longest period of general great power peace.
Absolutely.
ever, or since Roman times. I'm much too, the conservative side of me says, don't mess around with what we've achieved over the past 3 generations in the West generally, and over the past generation in this part of the West where we're sitting now.
Thank you. Julia, if I can ask you a little bit from, if you can put on the hat also of a Democrat for the debate in terms of, not that you have to change hats or anything like this, but is this, exactly. I mean, if there was a change in the White House in 2 years, what would change and what would remain the same? I mean, would we still see the competitive net framework through which U.S. is looking at China and Russia? What would happen with the emphasis on multilateralism and rule-based international system? I mean, basically, to what extent, I'm trying to get us to answer the question, to what extent is what Dan described a partisan approach, or to what extent this is becoming more of a U.S. approach?
Well, thank you, and that's a great question. When the national security strategy was rolled out very early, I would note, it was remarkable the speed with which the administration was able to churn out this document. Hats off to them, because this is just an enormous undertaking. So as soon as they rolled it out, I think as people leafed through it, both on the left and the right, I think there was broad bipartisan support across Washington for the key premise, the key change that we saw in the NSS. This emphasis on the return of great power politics, that we had a rising and ever stronger China and an increasingly weak Russia, but also a revisionist power, and that the United States needed to turn its attention to a changing dynamic on the world stage. And so I don't think you're going to find much disagreement among Democrats and Republicans on the overarching theme of the NSS. There's a lot of folks that now understand that the theory that the United States and China, or the United States and Russia, were converging politically and economically, that had a lot of holes in it, and that we've made mistakes about the assumptions we made about the broad trajectory of these 2 countries. So that's the first point. I think the second point is that there are some partisan disagreements across Washington, increasingly on some of the tactics behind this strategy, or not even the tactics, the lack of implementation on some of this. I think a change, for example, you'd see with a different administration, and this could be something you'd see with a different Republican president as well, is given the nature of these relationships now, the strategic competitive nature, revisionist powers with Russia and China, I think there are many in Washington that believe that we should put added emphasis on our alliances, one of America's great strengths, and our relationships around the world. I think the critique that's being made of Trump, not necessarily everyone in his administration, as Dan noted, but the president himself, is that he seems intent on undermining some of the relationships that have served us so well for the last 70+ years. And so I think the change you would see under a different administration, and again, this could be right or left, would be reinvesting in the alliances and the relationships. The mistake that folks in my party sometimes make, and I've been prone to this on occasion, is that we go back to defending the status quo. And I'm here to say and now admit that we're not going to go back to the status quo. What we can do is take a fresh look at the set of relationships and partnerships around the world that have served our interests, but they need a fresh look. Many of them are outdated. They can't address tomorrow's challenges like artificial intelligence and disruptive technologies. They need a reinvestment. It doesn't mean we throw them all out. the Trump administration has decided to pull us out of some of these things. I think where Democrats would want to double down is see how we can reinvest and reform some of these institutions and make them stronger. And I think fundamentally that might be one of the key differences right now. But again, we have to caution against people that say, well, let's just go back to the old system because it worked so well. That's just not going to work in today's environment. It's not going to work on this side of the Atlantic, and it's not going to work on my side of the Atlantic.
Thank you very much, Julie. So bipartisan consensus when it comes to the great power competition and strategic competition, but big differences when it comes to the need for alliance and allies, but potentially a new look at what that new set of alliances would look like. Let me go now to Mr. Zhang. You have been an observer of China's thinking for a long time. China has been the main target, so to say, or the main focus of Trump administration's competitive strategy. How is China thinking about it? How is it reacting? But also not in this, there is a question about the immediate aspects of potential or real trade war, but also, couple steps ahead as well.
Well, at the moment, I think the Chinese government is most concerned about the trade war. And if there were not the trade war, if we go back to the first year of the Trump administration, the Chinese government was actually quite happy with the Trump administration. And before the election, what the Chinese government was most concerned about was a Hillary Clinton administration, not a Trump administration. I think the way how the Trump administration has been dealing with American allies and the international liberal order is being seen quite positively in China. They will be quite happy to encourage and support President Trump in his pursuit of dividing the United States from the United States' traditional allies, upsetting the international liberal order. And the Chinese are not revisionists in the way that the Russians are. The Chinese want to actually stay in the international post-war order. They would prefer to take out the word liberal, but that international order has so far worked very well for China. And it's also an international order that is being changed, partly by initiatives from the Chinese government in order to accommodate the rise of China. And just look at the change in the way how, for example, human rights is being handled by the international community as a whole. The change from the old UN Commission for Human Rights to the current Human Rights Council meant that previously, China was a major target for criticism on human rights. Now China is a member of the Human Rights Council, and you are talking about a period in the post-Mao era when human rights has not been abused more than now, and nobody hear much about it. You heard it on BBC, you hear it in other news agencies. You don't hear it much from the Human Rights Council. So that order works well for China. They don't want to upset it. They want to change it, modify it, and the way how Trump is undermining the integrity of it makes it easier for the Chinese to achieve their objectives. So that's the good side from China's perspective of the Trump administration. The problem comes with the trade war, and the trade war is going to continue. It's difficult to see Trump backing off, and Xi Jinping cannot afford to back off on the trade war. His authority rests on being able to project that he is a strong man, he's a nationalist, he is the first defender of Chinese national interests, and it means standing up against the Trump administration if the Trump administration appears to be trying to bully China into some kind of submission. So there, in fact, the irony is that Xi Jinping shares a lot in common with President Trump. President Xi is a nationalist, perhaps even more stronger brand of nationalist than President Trump is. And President Xi also put great emphasis on sovereignty. That's being put right there. And they share one other common objective: make China great again. Oh, sorry, did I say that? But that's also what Mr. Trump has been doing, even though his objective was to make America great again, but he has been doing perhaps at least as much as President Xi in making China great again until the trade war comes along. And now we are going to have to deal with the consequences of how the two sides will maneuver and manage themselves moving forward with the trade war. But by the way, trade war is not necessarily a precursor to a hot war. So I don't think we need to assume that because the trade war is going to continue for a number of years, therefore the two countries are on a trajectory towards a hot war, whether we're talking about 10, 15, 20, 25 years.
Well, thank you very much. Make China great again. That's quite a way to summarize it. But let me push you on one thing, because you describe, when I listen to you, I almost hear you say that China is becoming a status quo power when it comes to especially the economic governance of the current system. In a way, US is actually trying to upend it to an extent. But then let me, what if we look, that's the economic realm, and you say there is not necessarily a link with the security piece. But what we are seeing is Pentagon preparing for a near power, basically great power competition in Asia. There is a system of alliances there that is right there, close to China. I mean, can you, if you could elaborate a little bit on the longer path of China's rise that incorporates the geopolitical questions, especially in the neighborhood, where US is very much a power as well. Do you see a way to accommodate the two powers in the Asian theater?
Well, this was answered by Xi Jinping when he went to meet with President Obama, actually, in Sunnyland, and he said, the Pacific Ocean is a very big ocean. It's big enough for two. His idea was, he didn't spell it out, but the underlying idea was really that there is no particular reasons why the Pacific Ocean should be just an American lake. It could be shared, and perhaps somewhere in between, all the part of the Pacific Ocean by the lines of those islands that are American-owned, Marianas, Marshalls, and all that. Well, yes, of course, those are the American part of the Pacific. But a bit further west, towards the Chinese coast, well, maybe the Americans shouldn't have done their job. They don't need to be there any longer. And the Chinese maritime strategy since the 1980s includes the building up of, in the first instance, the first island chain, which goes basically from Japan down through Taiwan into the Philippines, and that's where they actually see as the place that they actually need to hold and defend. And they are now building up naval and air capacities to more or less make it possible to look at that as a realistic option. 80s and 90s, they were just aspirations. Now it's something that is potentially achievable, but they can't get it there yet, and they know they are not going to be able to actually establish the first island chain. So the second island chain, which is much further out into the American islands, that's really at the moment very much an aspirational one. And they will be working to try to work with the Americans to get the Americans to accept and move back a bit so that they don't really have a problem in terms of confrontation. Now, of there you have both the issue of Taiwan, which the Chinese government does intend to resolve at some stage. And Xi Jinping more or less said that he will want to have it resolved before he stands down as leader of China. The saving grace there for the rest of the world, and not necessarily for China, is that President Xi has just abolished terms of office. And he is a very young and healthy 65 or 66. So he could be there for another 2 decades or even more. So there is no immediate time frame that they have to resolve the Taiwan issue now or the next 5 years. So if Taiwan is not going to be an issue where there is an American commitment under the Taiwan Relations Act for the Americans to help Taiwan defend itself, then there is not an immediate trigger for a confrontation. The Senkaku Diaoyu Island issue, which is covered, that's the East China Sea maritime dispute between China and Japan, is covered under the US-Japan Defense Treaty. But since the Americans have reiterated that commitment, the Chinese know that, and they are not going to push it in a way that will trigger a war with the United States that they know they cannot win. And then you have the South China Sea maritime disputes, and they are not actually covered by the defense treaties. At least the Americans have not come out to say that they are actually definitely, clearly, unmistakably covered by the defense treaties, and therefore any Chinese actions over there will actually result in American response. Now there you have a bit of a gray area, but by and large, most of your countries in Southeast Asia which have maritime disputes with China will back off. And therefore it's very difficult to see that as a triggers to escalate into a war with the United States at this stage.
Thank you very much. Well, that's very interesting. So not immediate triggers for escalation, somewhere down the line, also a question of Taiwan, but not necessarily anytime soon given the health longevity of President Xi. Mr. Felgenhauer, I wanted to ask you what Russia thinks about all this. I mean, we are, well, specifically first, in terms of the goals for a relationship with the US, I mean, we are looking from war, so what we are seeing is Russia that is on one hand clearly very much a revisionist power with annexation of Crimea, with war in Donbass, with military modernization and big exercises, really challenging the European security order. On the other hand, comparing to China, I mean, if we take the 3-4 decades perspective, maybe we can be a little bit more relaxed given the vulnerabilities of Russia's economy, which is clearly not the case in terms of China. So, I mean, if you could help us understand, especially the thinking in Moscow when it comes to the source of Russian power, then relations with the U.S. And there is, of course, a question in our minds, I think, when it comes to relations between Moscow and Beijing, and a question whether this could become a little bit more than an alliance of convenience and more of an alliance that really reshapes the future world order.
Okay, thank you. We just heard that, yes, the United States has a national security strategy, and it's a document, you can read it. It's a nice document. It was written by the team of General McMaster. Basically, that was the last thing he did, and then he exited his post, and now we have a different person, Mr. Bolton, who most likely has other ideas. In Russia, it's different. Our strategy was written by people that are still very much there in control. It was formulated in 2013. It's called the Plan обороны Российской Федерации, the Plan of Defense of the Russian Federation, which is a totally secret document, but what's not secret is it exists. But the threat assessment, part of it is better known because, as always in such documents, that's the more kind of open part, it's the threat assessment. And there it was reported in 2013, actually in mid-February, the Chief of General Staff, General Gerasimov, gave a lecture where he explained how Russia sees the future. And as it was formulated then, it's more or less the same thing stands now. So the threat of war is growing. There's a serious threat that there's going to be a world war between 20 and 30, or a series of large regional conflicts if a world war is avoided. And the threat is going to grow and grow. And why is that happening? There it also explains that there's going to be, in the 20s, a world resource crisis, a crunch. The prices of oil and gas are going to skyrocket, and Russia will be attacked from all directions by other nations that want to take over our gas and oil fields. And we should build up a capability to defend it. And we're building a perimeter defense on all sides. It's not only Ukraine or Crimea, it's 46 or something bases, new bases in the Arctic, perimeter defense, Pacific Rim, almost like in the well-known film, a division deployed in Chukotka, facing Alaska, a division of Coast Guard defense. So this is, and that is the main idea. So yes, of course, the Russian military and the Russian foreign policy and strategic planning are dominated by the Russian military, by the general staff, which is not fully understood in the West, or not actually fully understood in Moscow, because, well, those who, to know that, you have to be vetted, and if you're vetted, you don't go abroad to speak at conferences much, and so on. So that is the picture from Russia. That's what we're doing. We spent a lot of money in when this whole thing, program of rearmament began. It began since in 08 somewhere, and 10 years spent on at least on the exchange rate of 08. It's about $1 trillion worth. I mean, it's a lot of money, and for a rather not rich country like Russia. And of course, in this strategy, China is seen as also basically a potential enemy or competitor, at least in the initial stages. Well, and no military in its right mind, no military hierarchy in the world will ever ditch an enemy if they have one. I mean, the more enemies, the better. The best scenario if you're facing the entire world, as the Soviets did when they were in control, just minus the Warsaw Pact. And now Russian military would also like to see the entire world. But right now with China, yes, things are changing. It's seen as from Moscow, and actually as far as I can know in contacts from Beijing too, and from the Chinese military's point of view, that the United States is kind of pressing Russia and China together. In Beijing, several years ago, they were saying it's only a partnership. China is not an ally of Russia. Now they're not so sure about it. It's almost an alliance of sorts. But still, it's an alliance of sorts. It's not that Russia and China are preparing really and training really to fight together alongside. So yes, there was this first big exercise, Russia-China in the Vostok in September. Previous ones were kind of more anti-terrorist. This was not anti-terrorist, but this was a Chinese armored brigade interacting with the Russian armor on the battlefield in the Zabaykalya. But can you envisage Russia and China together fighting a major ground war, and against whom? Mongolia? I don't know. Because the real thing I've seen, at least in the Far East, is a naval air campaign with America and its allies. And there China apparently is not envisaged as a real player. So yes, the Russia and China are being pressed together, but they demonstrated in September in Vostok joint arms, but this was a demonstration of joint arms. And also for the Chinese benefit that this massive ground war game in Zabaykalya is not against them, since they are taking part. So that's where the things are kind of moving, seen from Moscow and seen from Beijing. But they're still far off from any kind of real meaningful alliance, because China wants us to take part, say, in military exercise in South China Sea. Russia right now increasingly depending on China on technology transfers, and the trade between Russia and China is growing. And especially right now, it's important, it's growing in investment goods. I mean, Russia is buying in China what was buying before in the West. Technologies, equipment for new factories, for modernizing its industry, for modernizing its military. And so this, we agreed to have a joint naval exercise in the South China Sea with the Chinese, but it was close to Hainan. It was not in the disputed waters because we have a special relationship with Vietnam that we also don't want to undermine despite our increasing closeness to China.
I want to follow up. So perimeter defense, Russia and China partners still of convenience rather than deep allies. But you haven't mentioned much about from Moscow looking west, looking toward Europe, and that's certainly of interest here in Warsaw.
Well, on the 10th of October this month, Sergei Ryabkov, who's the deputy foreign minister responsible for arms control and relationship with America, said that we're enemies. He said the collective West is our adversary. In the Russian translation in Interfox, it was противник, which is even a stronger word. It's not вероятный противник, simply противник. So, and he said that that's an interview he gave to Financial Times. So that means that he said there that Russia does not care how the West sees it in terms of kind of PR and everything because we're enemies anyway. So that's right now, the United States is seen as the arch enemy. In Europe, yes, there are Russian friends. And Russia, as always, as during actually the Cold War, that was the Russian policy, Soviet policy, to try to kind of separate Europe from America, undermine the transatlantic link. Now we have quite support coming in that direction from Trump and his administration, weakening the same link. Yes, that's seen as advantageous. Basically, there is this idea that Europe and Russia have the same interest. It's kind of sort of like a grand Finlandization of Europe, and that Europe has the capital, has the technologies, and we have the resources, and of course the Russians and the Russian elite and the Russian military and the Russian planners, at least the militarized part of the Russian government. There's another one that's not militarized, so-called Party of Peace, but anyway. The militarized one believe that the wealth of nations comes basically from what's in the ground. A very kind of not 21st century view, but that's how they see it. And they believe that with Europe we can kind of combine forces, only get the Americans out. I mean, the Americans out, the Russians in, and the Germans out.
Wow. Well, what a perfect segue to General Sharif. Russians in, Germans up, Americans out. So, General, I mean, the key question is what does NATO do about what Mr. Felgenhauer just mentioned in terms of the Russia's perception of the West, NATO, especially Americans, but NATO as a whole, as an adversary, przeciwnik in Polish, it works pretty well as well. And how do we stick with the alliance so maybe we don't fully fulfill the wishes in Moscow?
Well, what does NATO do? NATO starts off at least by doing what it has always done, or at least did very well during the Cold War, which is to protect Europe, protect the transatlantic region through effective deterrence. And NATO remains a defensive alliance, and it is therefore duty-bound to continue to protect the land borders, the airspace and the sea lines of communication of the alliance, and particularly the territorial defense of the East. But NATO needs to, and we heard good stuff from yesterday, I think, about NATO, generally speaking. I think one came away with a sense of an alliance that is heading in the right direction, and here we are on the eve of Trident Juncture, the biggest land-based exercise, I think, since the Cold War. But it is taking time to wake up, to be honest. And I think the next thing I would say is NATO needs to understand Russia, needs to recognize the challenge faced. And I think our Western, particularly our European populations, need to understand the fragility of peace. And my colleague's words about the dangers of sleepwalking, I think, are particularly apposite here. Because the reality is that I think for 90% of our populations, and I dare say it's probably the same among the young in Eastern Europe as well, who don't remember the Cold War, who were not alive during the Cold War, there is an assumption that peace is somehow the default setting in international relations, and that war is an aberration. Well, looked at over the sweep of history, that is not the case. And so peace needs to be worked for. NATO needs to be an effective force for deterrence. I think the good news has been the enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states and in eastern Poland, the work and the presence being committed to the Black Sea region in Romania and Bulgaria. But also NATO needs to really recognize the extent to which the art and science of war has been, in a sense, relegated to the past. We have a generation now who simply have no experience of or understanding of the complexity, the dynamics, and I'm speaking here from a professional military perspective, of the of fighting in, and how to fight, and therefore how to prevent fighting in major combat operations. Because what we have seen in NATO, what we have seen in the West, has been a steady disarmament, effectively, a cumulative disarmament over the last decade plus, a focus on difficult, dangerous, yes, at times extremely dangerous, operations in Afghanistan, for some Iraq, and for all in the 1990s, the Balkans. But that is very different from the sort of challenges that we might face if there is the sort of miscalculation which could precipitate a general war in Europe. And so it's about rebuilding the capabilities to be able to face up to that reality and be prepared to deter it.
Let me just one follow-up on this. I mean, yesterday you heard former Secretary General Rasmussen, who said militarily NATO is doing better. We are building up deterrence. We are building up our capabilities, even though maybe not fast enough, but we are weaker politically. Could you address that aspect, which is key for the strength of the alliance?
I think that's absolutely right. And the irony is that we have, I think, in President Putin, a strong leader of a relatively weak state. Look at the Russian economy in comparison to Western economies, who is facing up to weak leaders of relatively strong states, economically at least. And so I think in the West, certainly, what we see is a situation, I'm afraid to say, not unlike the 1930s. I don't think this is necessarily a return to the Cold War, but I think my concern would be that this is a time not unlike the 1930s, with international disorder, with the discrediting of international organizations, and leaders of states who are economically strong, but militarily and in some sense politically weak. And of course that political weakness is exacerbated, certainly in my own country, by the realities of what we're facing in March next year, and the sort of internal focus on that almost to the exclusion of everything else.
Thank you very much. Again, this theme of sleepwalking into trouble seems to emerge, and it's interesting. It's reported that Chancellor Merkel has recommended to her cabinet members to read the book about coming into how World War I started, called Sleepwalkers, and I think this is the the moment that we are all facing. I wanted to. I know that the panel, I'm sure, would like to react to each other's views, but I do also want to give everyone in the room a chance to ask questions. So let me take a couple questions before we come back to the panel, and I see a number of them. Gentleman here. Oh wow, we have lots of questions. Excellent. Let's start with you, sir. And if we could have a mic. Otherwise, projecting might be a little bit hard. Okay, I'll lose my mic. That's okay. We'll share. And if you could briefly introduce yourself and ask a question to specific panelists.
Sure. My name is Bobo Low. I'm an independent analyst. My question is to Steve Tsang, and it concerns the US's strategic allies and partners in Asia. How do you see China's relations with India, Japan, and even countries like Australia evolving over the next decade?
Great. If we could just pass the mic here to the center, and we'll go to the left as well. Oh, yeah, perfect. Great. Thanks, Bob.
Jonathan Isle from the Royal United Services Institute in London. Question to our American panelists, if I may. We had it dismissed rather easily with, are you kidding me, the question of a confrontation between the United States and China. So can we return to it for a second? Would Julie Smith accept, in what was her very cogent summary of where we are now, the feeling that perhaps the Democrats as well may reinterpret the way that they look at the whole relationship between the US and China, and the whole subject of our wrong premise that a richer China would be a more cooperative China and ultimately a peaceful one? It may be that in that respect, what Trump has done has been historic and irreversible, in which case, where do we go from here?
Excellent. There's a question here. The left flank. Could someone pass a mic to?
Yeah, I'm here.
Perfect.
Hello, Teresa Fallon, Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. I have a question for Pavel Falkenhauer. The Vostok 2018 exercise with China and Russia, there was a Chinese spy ship that was on the periphery of this. It was reported by USNI. Was that reported in Russia, and how did the Russian government respond? Thanks.
Perfect. And the last question here in the center, maybe gentlemen in the second row, and we'll have a chance for a second round. Yeah, thank you.
I'm Josh Moravchik from Washington. Also a question to Mr. Chang. Did I understand you correctly to say that Xi Jinping has said that the status of Taiwan must be resolved before he leaves office, and that it's reassuring that he's showing signs that he's not going to leave office anytime soon? That well may be, but why should we find that reassuring?
Thank you very much. If I can ask, so we'll come this way. If I could just ask you to answer relatively briefly, so we can have a second round. Maybe Steve, we could start with you with the questions about both Taiwan and U.S. allies, and then come this way.
Okay, thank you. I'll address the Taiwan question first. It does depend on how you see where China goes in the next 20 years or so. If you see it in the way how Xi Jinping sees it, China will become a near competitor. Perhaps 20 years, China may not be able to surpass the United States, but 30, 35 years, that would be his calculation, that by which point China would have surpassed the United States. Now, if on that trajectory, then we are going to be in big trouble, because at some stage, before he stands down, he will resolve the Taiwan issue, and that would potentially be war with the United States. But that linear trajectory, I think, is extremely heroic. The end of term of office for the leader of China also means that the scope for internal policy debate within the Communist Party of China has been dramatically reduced under Xi Jinping. It's a huge contrast to what happened in the previous 20 years when China was under first of all, Jiang Zemin and then Hu Jintao. We saw, regardless of how we feel about the political system in China, the Communist Party of China under Hu and Jiang, by and large, did not make major mistakes because there were a lot of internal policy debates that avoided those mistakes from being committed. I don't think one can say the same moving forward of Xi Jinping's 20 years, if he has 20 years to govern in China. He is extremely bright, extremely able, but he is not God. He will make mistakes. And in a system like that, when mistakes is being made by the top leader and not being preempted by others advising, things can get very terribly wrong. So I think that linear trajectory is very, very heroic, and therefore 20 years may well be the kind of time frames that will save us from having to deal with the kind of linear projection of a potential of a confrontation between China and the United States. Now, in terms of Bobo's question about China's relationship with its major neighbors, whether we're talking about Japan, India, or Australia, moving forward for the next decade, the Chinese are engaging with them. I think Prime Minister Abe, one of the most unpopular Japanese prime minister in recent Chinese history, is at the moment, I think, either setting off to China or just landing in China. And that is all because of the trade war with the Trump administration. There is a degree of flexibility and realism in Chinese foreign policy that enables the Chinese to focus on one principal adversary at any one time. I mean, that is what they call the United Front strategy, which means that China always focus on one principal contradiction, one principal enemy at any one time, and try to engage with anybody else and everybody else in order to neutralize them in that process. They are also doing that with India, and you therefore see a situation where a very nationalist Indian Prime Minister in Modi is actually also having a relatively good relationship with China, even though the Indian government as a whole is very tense about the intentions of China and the rise of China, and refuse to be part of the Chinese initiative called the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, Australia, your home country, I think is in a somewhat different situation with China because of what the Australians see as Chinese interference into domestic Australian affairs. And also because Australia is one of the core American airlines. And therefore, the capacity for the Chinese to engage Australia in a way that really would be able to detach Australia from the United States, when the Chinese are absolutely adamantly refusing to say that they have in any way possibly been interfering into Australian affairs, and all those were dreamed up by anti-Chinese journalists and a few politicians who have hidden agendas to damage that great relationship. That's not going to cut a lot of ice, I think, in Australia. And therefore, I think Australia, they are not going to get this satisfaction.
Thank you. Julie.
Well, again, I think if you sit down with a lot of the leading lights in the Democratic Party and have a conversation about China, I think you will get folks to say, look, looking back, we've made some mistakes. We've underestimated Xi as an individual, what his plans were, kind of what his track was, what his overarching goals. We misunderstood the appetite for new relationships and how China would soon be showing up in places like Europe. I don't think many of us expected to see that and so soon, and how they've been able to shape some of their bilateral relationships across the European continent. I think we've also underestimated the possibility for some sort of military conflict with the Chinese, always relying on kind of the Obama adage of, you know, the arc of history kind of heading in the right direction. I think many of us now, again, as I said in the opening, would step back, would understand why the new national security strategy looks the way it does. We would nod in approval with the overarching theme of a new focus on Russia and China, both of them, but But where I think many of us would take issue is how we've seen their strategy unfolding to date. So the strategy right now seems to have two pieces: escalating our potential trade war with China, heading down that path rather rapidly, and then two, now in recent days, admitting that we'd be willing to get into some sort of new arms race with the Chinese. And there, I think folks, frankly, on both sides of the aisle, are looking for a little bit more. We've heard a lot, particularly in Vice President Pence's recent speech about China, about their interference in our culture, in our politics, and all the rest. But I don't see any new tools being developed. I see Cyber Command being told to focus on disinformation a little bit more than they have in the past. But I really don't see resources being moved in the direction of the State Department. I don't see new positions being opened up to tackle this challenge. I don't see any acknowledgement of the Russian piece of that exact same challenge. And so there are missing components to this. Again, the focus on allies and our relationships around the world, the focus on our values that we share with our allies around the world, and the still, despite it all, some prospect for pragmatic cooperation in a couple of key areas. I don't think I'm prepared to say that all is lost in terms of finding avenues of cooperation. I think particularly when it comes to climate, that's where you would see a big partisan divide. I think the Democrats would see some prospect of working with the Chinese on climate, and obviously for this administration, that seems to be a non-starter. So again, I think the overarching idea of putting this added emphasis on Russia and China strikes many of us across Washington as a good one. I think when it comes to the actual implementation of that strategy, that's where we start to differ.
Thank you very much. Then maybe we can come to you for a comment, if you would like to comment on also what Julie just said, and then we'll come back to the general for a second.
Well, the question was U.S.-China relations, and I think Steve Tsang got it right. That is, China is half in the rules-based world system because it's gained a lot from it. And with the other half, it is exploiting that system, and she sort of reminds me in an odd way of Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Germany is rising in the 19th century. Everything is breaking their way. So what's he in such a damned hurry for? You know, why is he picking a fight with Great Britain? Why is he throwing elbows everywhere? Just relax. So that's the danger. The solution is not that hard to figure out. Push back on China's predatory trade practices, and then don't alienate your natural allies as you're trying to do so. So the Trump administration should be working with Europe and its Asian allies who are worried about both China's strategic overreach and its trade practices, and that gives the United States a lot of assets. Now that requires a kind of subtle strategy of cooperation with China on one hand, and pushing back on China on the other. And the Trump administration famously doesn't do subtle, okay? But the solution is there somewhere in that space, and the situation is far from hopeless if we would simply not be, if we Americans would not be dumb about it. This is still a fixable problem.
Thank you. General? If you wanted to comment on anything that was said too, but one thing that I wanted to point, maybe a question from me, because I'm not sure how much of a chance we'll have for second round, is, I mean, it's very much US, China, Russia focused conversation. We are a little bit forgetting about Europeans in all this. I mean, one thing that, if I could ask you to comment on, what we are seeing on the one hand in Europe is push for something called strategic autonomy, whatever that means, and if I can ask you for a comment on this. But on the other hand, one could make a case that allies that are a little bit less sure, I mean, let's put it this way, there is a push also for more bilateral relations directly with United States as a linchpin to the order, even if there is a bit of a weakness of the alliance as a whole. If you could comment on this before we go back.
Well, it's entirely respectable that European nations should be developing bilateral relations and continue to develop those very strong bilateral relations with the United States. After all, look at the origin of much of the population of the United States. And the United States has deep roots in Europe and with different European countries. But at the same time, that should not work against the importance of strengthening and building up the multilateral institutions. And I think going back to one of the points that was made earlier, particularly in the Russian context, what is Mr. Putin looking for? He's looking to decouple America from European defense. He's looking to neutralize, if not destroy NATO as an alliance, which he sees as a threat. And that places an even greater imperative on European nations and America to work together. And of course, what do we come back to again and again? We come back to defense spending and burden sharing. And so long as European nations continue to duck the issue of the fabled 2%, and I take the point that Ben Hodges made yesterday that it's a pretty blunt instrument, but nevertheless it is important. So long as European nations who have signed up to the 2% of GDP on defense but don't put their money where their mouth is, continue. What that will continue to do is exacerbate, I would suggest, the anti-NATO tendencies in America, the tendencies that say, why the hell should we put our dollars, our young men and women, into harm's way to defend you fat, happy Europeans who are all spending all your money on social security when we've got trouble, we've got issues back home as well. Of course that's the case. So the Europeans, and I include all the European nations in this, not just those who allegedly say they're spending 2%, because I can tell you there's a hell of a lot of creative accounting going on in that area. All European nations need to put their shoulder to the wheel and really demonstrate that they're willing to fund NATO defense spending. And here I would say, be careful of the siren call of Europe as a European defense identity. I would say that, wouldn't I? But to me, the danger is that initiatives, and it's important that the European Union has got an important role for certain types of security operations. It's done very well in, for example, the Horn of Africa. The EU operation in the counter-piracy mission was an arguably more successful mission than the NATO mission. But let's not kid ourselves that the defense of Europe remains the province of NATO. And that depends on binding America even more closely into European defense.
Thank you very much. Mr. Felgenhauer, there was a specific question to you, but I would also ask you to react a little bit to General Sharif in terms of what is there any conversation in Moscow about European strategic initiative, PESCO, EII? How is this seen in Moscow, if at all?
And which initiative?
Okay. Good. Then you can answer the question directly. Thanks.
I don't know, there were three actually important naval engagements connected to Vostok, two directly. One was in the Sea of Okhotsk, the other in the Arctic Ocean in the Sea of Chukotka, and at the same time there was also, though not officially part of it, a major war game of Russian Navy in the Mediterranean, a task force of over 20 ships and aircraft and landings and on Chukotka and landings in Syria of Marines. Where there was a Chinese ship, I don't know, it was not reported. But maybe there was, maybe there was not. But what is important that yes, the Russian-Chinese partnership is morphing somewhat into an alliance is a very uneasy one. That's a fact. There's a lot of mutual misunderstandings or things that Russia doesn't like what China is doing, China doesn't like what Russia is doing, Russia is complaining that Chinese banks are not holding back in financing and not opening accounts for Russians because they're afraid that they'll be slapped American sanctions and so on. So it's not, and the current Russian leadership, military and political, some guys about 60, some are over 60, some are just approaching 60. These are people who entered service in the Soviet times when China was the main adversary. I mean, America and other places of the world on the ground, in the army ground kind of confrontation, China was seen as the main adversary in the 80s. So they have a suspicion of China, China has a suspicion of Russia. It's an uneasy alliance partnership, and so it's more America pressing us together than Russia and China extending on their own. It's both, but the American pressure most likely is more right now important in forming this alliance.
Thank you very much. We are almost out of time, pretty much, but I want to give each panelist literally 1 minute to answer to answer following question, totally blue sky in a way. I mean, we've been talking here about shifting tectonic plates of alliances and power. And we are, we have been discussing here possibility of economic conflict going hot or not. If you could, in 1 minute, each of you, give your prescription of, if we take the perspective of the next 20 years, what do you think should be the key component in maintaining peace? So we actually, when we meet at the Warsaw Security Forum in 2030, we are talking about what a wonderful situation we are still in. And just please be brief. Steve, we'll start with you and come this way.
I can do this in less than 1 minute. I think the key, from my perspective dealing with China, is that we have to continue to engage with China with our eyes wide open and engage China to get China to play by international rules and norms and not simply getting away with the way how they have been getting away with it so far. If they do that, I don't think war is necessary.
Thank you.
Just quickly as a footnote, as I talk about kind of how Democrats have looked back at their views on China, I will say that the one person that seemed to be a little bit ahead of the curve is President Obama, in pushing for the pivot to Asia, seemed to clearly appreciate, in fact, he did appreciate the importance of our relationship with China going forward and how America strategically needed to shift to the Pacific. Now, we didn't succeed necessarily in delivering on all of the ideas, but I think it's important to remember that. In terms of where to invest going forward, I mean, it comes back to my original opener. I do think we've got to double down on our relationships and partners and alliances around the world. We've got to take a look at the values that we share with those partners and reinvest in the future of democracy as a common project for all of us.
Thank you very much.
Two things, deterrence and dialogue. I've talked about deterrence, but we haven't talked about dialogue, particularly in the context of relations with Russia. It really worries me that the sort of dialogue we had at all levels with Russia before 2014 does not exist now, and therein lies the danger of miscalculation.
Thank you. Dan?
2 points. Values and interests are linked. This is the 100th anniversary of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points and the 100th anniversary of the regaining of Polish sovereignty. National interests are their strongest and most compelling when they are linked with values. Therefore, we start with the community of the West and the democratic world, the free world as our core. As Julianne said, fix it, but start with it. That's how you deal with revisionist or nihilist powers like Russia or powers half in, half out like China. Start with what we've got, build out from there.
Thank you, Pavel.
Well, the previous Cold War was cold only in the Central Front here in Europe. In the world, there was raging proxy wars in Africa, Asia, Latin America. And right now, yes, we have again a Cold War of sorts in Europe. and a Cold War of sorts between America and its allies and China, and there are proxy wars raging around and in Europe, in Donbass, in Syria, and in parts of Asia. So the thing is to control and manage the proxy wars that are going to happen, not to allow them to get out of hand, to keep the code, confrontation code between China and the West, Russia and the West, and muddle through to some kind of future.
That was not exactly optimistic, but I think we got it. So fix the alliances, base them on values and interests, engage China, engage Russia, but don't let them get away with rule breaking, and then manage the unavoidable proxy wars that we might see in the meantime and muddle through to a better future. Well, thank you, everyone. Please join me in thanking our panel. And over to Kasia.